Okay, we've commenced recording. So welcome everybody to tonight's meeting of Reasonable Faith Adelaide. I'm Kevin Rogers, I'm the director. Tonight we are talking on the decline of Western Christianity with a question mark next to it. Is it occurring? What caused it? And what do we do about it? So there'll be two speakers tonight. The first speaker is Dr. Gordon Stanger. Now, just to give a little bit of information about Gordon, Dr. Gordon Stanger is a geologist, a hydrologist, a water resources specialist, and a climate change impact analyst. He is semi-retired and is a keen advocate of sensible Christianity. And he's a doctor. I am not. I'm trying to get there, and I'm hitting a few hurdles, so it may come or may never come. But indeed, if I just pop the screen down, you can see at least I have a Reasonable Faith Adelaide t-shirt, and he doesn't. Right. So Gordon is the first speaker, and so I'm now going to hand it over to him.
Oh, wow. Afterwards, you'll have to tell me, Kevin, how you got the t-shirt.
It's a secret.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, notwithstanding some notable exceptions, an overall decline in church attendance, and by extension the Western Church in general, has been in decline, well, certainly since the 1960s and arguably even earlier. And this has been abundantly documented in church and government statistics, in academic books, documentary films, social science papers, and the popular press. So the reality is consistent, and it's pretty much beyond doubt. Now, consider two verses from Scripture. 2 Peter 3:9 says, God is not slack concerning his promise. The Lord is not willing that any should perish. And in 1 Timothy 2:4, God says, wants all people to be saved and to come to a knowledge of the truth. So given God's clear preference, it's hard to see how a decline in the Western Church could be of God's volition. So the problem comes down to us Western Christians. Does it? Or should we put the blame on the godless world? Well, I would argue it's a bit of both. Oh, sorry, I've got the wrong thing here. Trying to get to the next slide. What am I doing wrong? Ah, there we are. For some time, I've been collecting statistics from quite a wide variety of sources, and these include surveys, medium to large scale in Australia, Europe, mainly the UK and Europe, and America, together with individual church statistics and assessments, and the view of pundits from all kinds of media. So all told, gathering all this rough trawl together, we come up with about 55 reasons that have been cited for the church's decline. Now, some of these I would regard as dubious and inconsistent or sometimes self-contradictory. But nevertheless, whether I agree with them or not, I'm going to list the 25 most frequently cited reasons for church decline, together with a simplified index called the RCF, the Relative Citation Frequency, which is on a scale of 1 to 9. So 1 is not a very frequent reason, 9 is an almost universally mentioned reason. It isn't a rigorous academic survey, but I think any survey that looks at reasons for decline will come up with pretty much the same, or more or less the same, mix of reasons. So here's the top 10. Most surveys put life distractions at the top of the list. I've got them here as prosperity, affluence, hedonistic materialism, the children going to sports on a Sunday morning and other recreation, family commitments and so on. There's a whole swag of distractions which are really excuses for not going to church. People just put up these excuses. For these people, the church is irrelevant. Well, it seems irrelevant until there's a crisis in their life, of course. Such is human nature, which we see repeated multiple times through history from Exodus onwards. And we see it with our friends and associates in every walk of life. The church's clash with science is one of the top 3 most frequent reasons cited for abandoning the Christian faith. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who could and should have been secure in God's kingdom are now almost certainly lost because of the church's fight with demonstrably correct science. I could talk all evening on this one topic alone. It's a sort of hobby horse of mine. Hopefully I'll get to talk a bit on another occasion. But suffice to say, in my view, this church fighting with science is an own goal for the credibility of Christianity. Whether it is in the physical realm or the spiritual realm, truth cannot contradict truth. That's a logical imperative. So this apparent clash of worldviews is an utterly false and contrived problem. It shouldn't even exist. But it's born of bad theology and bad science. And it comes directly from fundamentalist failure to read Hebrew literature correctly. The fundamentalists come up with these slogans: Darwin versus Jesus, evolution versus the Bible. These either or arguments are both profoundly false constructs, and they're misguided predominantly by American evangelical Christians who think they're doing God a favor, and frankly they aren't. The third big excuse is another of the church's own goals: predatory and hypocritical sexual exploitation, largely, but not entirely, within the Catholic Church. The damage to Christianity has been horrific. The hypocrisy of the church's strict stance on illegal sex, contrasted with the very public failure of the church to live up to its own standards, has been seized upon by the church's detractors. Some have suggested that it will be generations before the established church regains its credibility. The church has generally taken a very tolerant attitude towards those whose hypocrisy tarnishes the church. But if we look in Acts 5, we see the example of Ananias and Sapphira. And it makes me wonder if the church should take a considerably stricter stance towards discipline within its own people, within its own leaders. Another reason: 6 months ago, politicization of the church wouldn't even have been in the top 10 reasons for decline. But linkage between the evangelical right wing of American Christianity with the Republican Party, and hence with lies, falsehood, conspiracy theories, and the blatant hypocrisy of Trumpism, is prompting young people to leave American evangelical Christianity in droves. And this is another disaster for God's kingdom. Competition with other belief systems. This has always been a problem, especially for young people who go to college having been brought up with just one single worldview, and at college they discover the range of beliefs on offer. And moreover, the internet has brought access to alternative belief systems on an unprecedented scale. The church has largely failed to build up young people's belief systems to withstand this challenge. The church's traditional view on sex and upon homosexuality in particular, and sexual prohibitions in general, has been a huge turn-off for modern youngsters. So I question, do we need to completely rethink Christian sex education, putting emphasis upon positives where the church has previously put its emphasis entirely on the negative aspects? If the church is irrelevant, isn't it because there was no authentic relationship with God to start with? When people see a good working relationship between the Christian and his or her Lord, the church will automatically become attractive and hence more relevant. That was Jesus' model. Lack of unity in the church is obvious to all. It's disgraceful and another own goal for Christianity. Moreover, it's a direct slap in the face of Jesus, who specifically prayed for unity amongst his followers. Let me just quote a little bit from John 17. Jesus said, "My prayer is not for them alone. I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message, that all of them may be one, Father.
Oh,
Just,
people are,
Yeah,
right.
sorry.
just as you in me and I am in you.
Whoops. Yeah.
May they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. I have given them the glory that you gave me, that they may be one as we in one.
It hasn't asked you to.
One in them and you in me."
You want to do the video?
Or not necessarily, I'm just going to listen, but get that.
Excuse me, could you please unmute your microphone so you don't hear with the speaker? Yeah, because we can hear people talking in the background.
Yeah, thank you. So this quotation from John, it goes on, so that they may be brought to complete unity, then the world will know that you sent me and have loved them even as you have loved me. Now let me just reiterate one sentence from that and emphasize it. May they also be in us, that's us, Jesus is talking about us, may they also be in us, Jesus and the Father, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. That's the purpose of unity that Jesus is praying for, so that his kingdom will expand, that people will believe. Okay, so unity is a problem. The most obvious poor leadership is seen in American televangelists with their private jets, their palatial homes, lavish lifestyles, and constant appeals for more money to continue the ministry. Less obviously, it may take discernment to distinguish worldly from God-led ministers. Perhaps we need more prophets to hold ministers to account when their directions stray from God. We don't hear much about prophets in our churches in modern times. A fading, scripturally sound view is an inevitable feature of the secular, media-dominated age. To counter it, we need, first of all, church unity to fund the Christian voice in the media, and secondly, a scripturally sound, tenable worldview. I would emphasize again that this is not what's on offer from the dominant cultural religion, namely from American evangelicals. Arguably, the Christian worldview which is on offer is at least a century out of date. It's just not helpful in the educated and savvy Western world that we're in at the moment. The next few 10 reasons. We don't need to examine every cause, but there are a few we should mention. Weak teaching leads to shallow faith, which breeds cognitive problems as people become better educated and more spiritually mature. We see this, it's a common failing in, for example, many Pacific nations, which are inordinately prone to cults and false teachings. For example, Seventh-day Adventists, Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, and the like, they all abound in this region. And they become strong because mainstream Christian teaching is weak. Deconversion through sexual relations has always been problematic. Nothing new there. But decline in parental influence has increased over the decades. And most particularly, that influence, Christian influence, is where only one parent is Christian. So perhaps we should take 2 Corinthians 6:14 a bit more assiduously. Do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship has righteousness with lawlessness? And what communion has light with darkness? I would have ranked weak evangelism higher than 15th, but well, that's how it works out in the statistics. The old Billy Graham crusade evangelism was good in its day, but it doesn't work anymore. The Alpha 4, of course, is a good step. And we now need inviting events to follow up with a different Alpha course, followed by Beta and Gamma, and so on until the full spiritual development is attained. Just leading people to Christ and then leaving them as newborn babies, spiritually speaking, is cruel and irresponsible. The job isn't done until the new Christian attains maturity. Spiritual intolerance is perhaps a bit more noise again. Someone mute their.
Yeah, I've muted them. Yep.
Anyway, yeah, religious intolerance is the flip side of love. Either way, it's a poor advertisement for the Lord, and it's yet another own goal for Christianity. The last few. Of the last 5 reasons for decline, I think number 23 stands out as something we could easily correct. Just having a more open church with opportunity for questions and discussion, especially among the young and the well-educated cohorts, would make the church so much more accessible. Some people have mentioned demographic shifts. I think if Christians move from one church to another, it's no net gain for the kingdom. It's just a local gain for or loss for the church involved. Where reform is needed is just as important as what is needed. As the map shows, if you just look at the yellow areas on this map, this is where serious decline in the church throughout almost all the Americas, Europe, Australia, and New Zealand, as Kevin said. A few areas in Africa and Japan, and a few other areas, but basically, yeah, it's about 40% of the global inhabitants are in Christian decline. But as you can see, the flip side of that is that there's significant growth, particularly in Africa and, well, most of Asia. The exception being the Middle East, where, of course, Islam is kicking back. Okay, some general observations. First of all, the church has seasons. We can't expect continued evangelical growth of Christianity all the time, uninterrupted. There are multiple cycles of decline and revival. And often the revival is in the most unexpected places. Many of the reasons for decline, at least a third, are self-inflicted by the myopic church with its own goals that we could have seen and should have acted upon. But the church has not been attentive to the Lord's leading. We have been arrogant, thinking our perception is correct, not the Lord's worldview. We have been painfully slow to change and dull of hearing. We have been disobedient to both the Lord's Logos and Rhema. There should have been prophets in these last days, but they have been either silent or missing, and I wonder why. But as the prophet Jeremiah indicated, all is not lost. Also, the imagery of 1 Samuel 6 is often glossed over, although it is one of the most profound parables in the Old Testament. I'd like to go on to unpack this a little bit and to indicate where the church may find restoration. It is the subject of 1 Samuel 6 is the restoration of the Ark of the Covenant. And I've talked a little bit about this in the past. Just we can maybe talk about this during the discussion time, but for the moment, just to remember that the Ark of the Covenant is in every conceivable respect looking forward to Jesus. It's just dripping with Christological symbolism. So let us just go through this 1 Samuel. Just quote. When the Ark of the Lord had been in Philistine territory 7 months, the Philistines called for the priests and the diviners and said, "What shall we do with this Ark of the Lord? Tell us how we should send it back to us." They answered, "If you return the Ark of the God of Israel, do not send it back to him without a gift. By all means, send a guilt offering to him. Then you will be healed, and you will know why his hand has not been lifted from you." The Philistines asked, "What guilt offering should we send to him?" They replied, 5 gold tumors and 5 gold rats, according to the number of the Philistine rulers, because the same plague has struck both you and your rulers. Make models of the tumors and of the rats that are destroying the country, and give glory to Israel's God. Perhaps he will lift his hand from you and your gods and your land. Why do you harden your hearts, as the Egyptians and Pharaoh did? When Israel's God dealt harshly with them, did they not send the Israelites out so they could go on their way? Now then, get a new cart ready, with 2 cows that have calved and have never been yoked. Hitch the cows to the cart, but take their calves away and pen them up. Take the Ark of the Lord and put it on the cart, and in a chest beside it, put the gold object you are sending back to him as a guilt offering. Send it on its way, but keep watching it. If it goes up to its own territory, towards Beth Shemesh, then the Lord has brought this great disaster on us. But if it doesn't, then we will know that it was not his hands that struck us, but that it happened to us by chance. So they did this. They took 2 such cows and hitched them to the cart and penned them up to their calves. They placed the Ark of the Lord on the cart, and along with it the chest containing the gold rats and the models of the tumors. Then the cows went straight up towards Beth Shemesh, keeping on the road and lowing all the way. They did not turn to the right or to the left. The rulers of the Philistines followed them as far as the border of Beth Shemesh. Now, the parable maybe isn't immediately obvious. So I'll give it, first of all, a little bit of background. The parable works for the whole of the church just as well as it does for the individual Christian. Now, Israel had disobeyed the Lord, and in consequence, the Philistines had won battles against Israel, captured the Ark of the Covenant, and taken it into hostile pagan territory, the coastal plain cities of the Canaanites. After some incidents in which the God of Israel defeated the pagan god Dagon, bubonic plague spread amongst the Philistine cities. They devised a test to see if this pestilence was of God, or did it come by chance? Well, they should have known. It was obvious. The Philistines knew very well of all the events of Exodus. The parable's main point is that the pagan world is watching carefully to see if the God of Israel has a genuine influence upon events. This is just a grab from Google Earth. So Beth Shemesh is here, sort of at the foot of the hill country. This is on the right-hand side of the picture. This is all the hill country. At the summit, at the highest points, this area around here is Jerusalem. And these are the lowlands down here. This is where the Philistines' cities existed. These are still to this day Palestinian cities. And the distance between the Philistine cities and Beth Shemesh is about 30 kilometers as the cow walks. Specifically, the parable has the following meaning. The cows gated by the Ark of the Covenant were in Philistine territory, but destined for the Promised Land, just as the church is in the world, but destined for heaven. The cows were under a yoke, as the church is under the control of Jesus. Remember, the yoke had included the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant represents Jesus himself. Despite the yoke, the cow's natural instinct was to go back to their calves, just as the church's natural instinct is to turn away from God to do its own thing. The Philistine kings followed the cows to see if they turned aside, just as the world watches the church to see if we are genuinely guided by the Lord. Under their yoke, the presence of the ark compelled the cows to go direct towards the kingdom of Israel, turning to neither right nor left, just as under the Lord's guidance, the church is required to follow him without being sidetracked by worldly distractions. The cows were lowing as they went, straight to their destination. The church may be tempted by worldly cares, but must be obedient to the Lord's leading, even if it is against their natural inclinations. Ekron, the Philistine city, to Beth Shemesh was all uphill, hard going, just as the church's godly walk in the world is hard going. The cow's arrival in Beth Shemesh, the promised land, was met with rejoicing, just as there is rejoicing in heaven over every sheep that is saved, and every church that makes disciples for the kingdom. So, our main conclusion is that it isn't just us who sees the church in decline. The godless world is watching to see, is the church genuinely guided by the Lord? Is the church hypocritical or true, spiritual or worldly? Is the church's love sacrificial and Christ-like? Is the church primarily loving or intolerant? What is the perception to the non-Christian, in other words? Is the church united in its teaching? Is the church's teaching consistent with reality, with science, for example? Is the church so much empty ritual? And most recently, have US evangelicals prostituted their faith on the altar of political expediency? All these perceptions have largely determined the Western Church's success or failure. I do not subscribe to the notion the Western Church is forever doomed. In Psalm 147, verse 2, we read, "The Lord builds up Jerusalem. He gathers the outcasts of Israel." It took 40 generations for Israel to escape from bondage in Egypt. It took more than 40 years for Israel to enter the Promised Land. It took 50 years for the siege of Jerusalem and the destruction of Solomon's temple before Cyrus's edict for the return of the Jewish exiles. God's timetable may not be ours, but it is quite on the cards that the Western Church could revive if we are humble enough to reform ourselves according to the Lord's direction. Okay, that's basically what I have to say, and let's hear Kevin's take on it.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gordon. Could you stop sharing?
Sure. Yep.
Right, and I will see how I go with the technology. And I'll put my screen across. So can you see that?
Yep.
Right. Thank you very much, Gordon. And I appreciate what Gordon says, and I'm not really contradicting, don't intend to contradict anything he says, but I will be taking a bit of a different slant and taking a little bit of a more historical view. Just current general features of the state today. In Western cultures, the majority identify as Christian still, but mostly these people are non-practicing. So a much smaller percentage attend church regularly. So amongst Anglo-Saxons within the Western world, Christianity is declining, and people who profess no religion are increasing in percentages. Within the Christian community, most of the growth is actually occurring within charismatical Pentecostal churches, and most of the decline is within traditional and liberal churches. And at the current state now, Christianity is largely in conflict with recent changes in social values, and generally on the nose, and its values are ridiculed. Within non-Western cultures, it's quite different, as what Gordon has highlighted. There's significant growth. Asia, and especially China, Africa, and some parts of South America. So what are the causes? The decline in the West has been evident since 1900 or even much before. So it's not just due to recent events. Recent issues such as cultural values versus Christian values may be the result of the decline rather than the cause. So it's kind of, it feeds itself, that you're in a cycle of the cause and effect. And so there's been a huge amount of change in recent years. So what's changed? Before, I'll just adjust the screen, sorry. Yes. Just giving some background. Before Constantine came to power around about 313 AD. Before Constantine, Christianity was a significant and persecuted minority. Constantine and later Christian emperors sponsored Christianity and made it popular. So Christianity has actually dominated Western culture from the time of Constantine, with his rise to power in 313 AD, through to even as late as 1900 AD. Now, during all this period, the church has always had problems, such as differences in theology and practice, hypocrisy, meddling in politics. So that's been going on through all that period, and yet for over 1,000-year period, the church grew despite all these problems. So what's changed in modern times to actually cause the decline? So here I go in a bit more detail. I've already mentioned about pre-313, Christian being a persecuted minority. Now, Constantine legalized Christianity. Prior to that, there was a great persecution under Diocletian, and but he legalized Christianity and removed a lot of the persecution. So the Christianity was then sponsored by the state. What Constantine did, he actually provided religious freedom to a large extent. He didn't make Christianity the state religion, but he provided financial support. He provided restitution from all the buildings and property that were damaged during the persecutions. And it was under later emperors that Christianity became the state religion. So what then happened was that you had a 1,000-year domination of the West by Christianity, and it was developed into Roman Catholicism. But around about the 15th century, a few key events occurred which caused a change in trends. So we had the Renaissance in the 15th century, which was the rediscovery of classical Greek culture. The Reformation under Martin Luther and John Calvin. So that we had a split between the Roman Catholic and the Protestant Church, and this undermined Roman Catholic authority. Then we had the early modern science movement. And the early modern science movement was mostly Christian based. As far as Kepler was concerned, science was thinking God's thoughts after him. So the start roots of science is strongly Christian. And then the next movement was the Enlightenment. So this is a very rough brush. Even there, the Enlightenment, even though it's considered an opposing force to Christianity, the early proponents were actually Christian. So the keen starters of the Enlightenment were Descartes, Leibniz, Locke, and Bishop Berkeley, and all these people were Christians. So Descartes and Leibniz were the founders of what's called rationalism, that's finding the truth through reason, and Locke and Bishop Berkeley were the founders of empiricism, which is finding the truth through experiment, empirical experiment. So, but as the Enlightenment developed, the later proponents were more skeptical. They were either deistic or atheistic, and examples of these are David Hume and Voltaire. So the two means of finding truth, reason and empiricism, were a challenge to traditional views which based truth on revelation. After this, you had the movements into biblical criticism, where people started challenging the historicity of the Bible. And in the 20th century, science kind of morphed away from being Christian-based, and instead of just seeking natural causes, people took the position that only natural causes occurred, and they had skepticism towards the supernatural. All these movements were dominated by the elite, but eventually all this sort of stuff trickles down to the mainstream people. So in general, the church had dominated Western intellectual thought. Christianity was supported by the state. Church attendance was a sign of respectability. Then things changed. Gordon's already mentioned the effect of affluence. So people were distracted due to affluence. They were distracted by recreation and work. We had the collapse of the protection of Sunday. So Sunday was no longer the Lord's day. People could do other things. Democracy meant that people chose their own authorities in accordance with their own desires. And so there was overall a loss of cultural control. As far as cultural control is concerned, the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church actually maintained a relatively good, strong authority structure and community control. And the Anglicans were a bit weaker in this area, and so they suffered high losses compared with the Catholics and the Orthodox. That's my understanding anyway. Other factors. Irrelevance. With the rise of public schools, Christianity, for the sake of tolerance, was excluded. It's not kind of part of the curriculum. So within public schools, they weren't antagonistic against Christianity. It was just ignored. Likewise, in universities, there was some antagonism against Christianity, but mainly Christianity was just ignored. And so even though a lot of the foundations of science, the Christian contribution to science, was never mentioned. Like, I'm an electrical engineer, and if you know vehicles IR, you can just about do most of electrical engineering. So that is volts equals current times resistance. But the interesting thing about this equation are the people who are associated with each of those elements, V, I, and R. V is volts, and it's named after Volta. I is current, and the units of current are amperes. R is resistance, and the units of resistance are ohms. These three characters, Volta, ampere, and ohm, are all Christian. We're all Christian, but it's never mentioned in the course. The other person who's really big in electrical engineering is Michael Faraday. He's been called the greatest of all experimentalists. But he was also an elder of what's called the San Dominion or Foot Washers Church. He was highly Christian, but you'd never know going through your electrical engineering course. It's all just ignored. So when kind of Christianity is excluded from these institutions that people are brought up in, God seems remote. One of the things that kind of strikes me, this is kind of my own opinion, I come from a low church, which is a Baptist church, and when I go into high churches, it kind of seems a bit weird to me. And I kind of wonder whether the high church liturgy does not resonate with modern attitudes, like us Australians are pretty laid back. So at this moment, the most growth in the West and in Australia as well seems to be occurring in charismatic churches. And we've got a couple of pictures over here on the right of big charismatic gatherings, and I don't know who this strange bloke is here. In actual fact, for those who watch this from overseas, this person here is, oh, got a brain fog. What's that Prime Minister's name?
Scott Morrison.
Right, thank you. That's Scott Morrison. He's the current Prime Minister of Australia, and he's a card-carrying charismatic. So there you go. The charismatic church, some people may consider this unfair, but I say a lot of it's aimed at the emotions. So it feels real and relevant, and so it does actually get a lot of grip on people. I wonder whether it's a good long-term foundation for growth, but some people will have to make their comments on it. Then there's the effect of the media. Well, whenever anybody watches TV, you get hit with a lot of advertising, and so it permeates into our attitudes. So the inherent thing behind it is the promise of happiness through buying goods. So materialism is in our face all the day. And it reminded me of the movement, or the term bread and circuses, which was coined by a Roman poet called Juvenal in 140 AD. So bread and circus referred to the fact that aspiring politicians adopted this tactic. They provide superficial appeasement to the crowds by giving them cheap food and entertainment in the hope that it would help their career develop as politicians. And so, but Juvenal complained about this. He said, this actually distracts the population for something that's really important by offering them cheap food and entertainment. So it's the same today. We have this in our face all the time, that we're offered cheap entertainment and food, and it's a distraction. Then the depiction in films and TV episodes, often Christians are depicted as corny or evil or corrupt. And I've got a picture of this person here. I can remember his name. He's Neddy Flanders, even though I forgot our Prime Minister's name. And he's innocent, sweet, corny, dumb. And that's kind of the image that's kind of depicted of the kind of Bible-believing Christian. So all these kind of stereotypes and distractions creates a barrier of prejudice. So Christianity is assumed to be silly, and it's discarded without people even seeking or investigating. Fideism, that means belief without evidence. In philosophy, knowledge is defined as justified true belief. But there does seem to be some anti-intellectualism in churches. So if you go along to a church, they open the Bible, read it out, and you're expected just to believe it because it's in the Bible. So Christian truth claims are assumed, but not justified. So when young people get this, they go on to university, gets challenged at university, and there's nothing to provide a foundation. However, there has been a decline. Should the decline actually surprise us? The cycles of decline and revival are repeated in the Old Testament, especially in the period of the Judges and the period of the monarchy. So, it's a bit unsurprising that this cycle would actually be repeated. It was unsurprising that this is repeated in the history of the church. Also, because the church had so much popular and state support during a period of 1,000 years, how genuine was it? So has genuine Christianity ever been popular? So much cultural Christianity may have been nominal, but now the cultural support has been stripped away. So is my minority status expected? Well, this seems to be the case from with the words of Jesus himself, where he says, enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. So this may actually be the new normal and be very similar to what happened before Constantine. So was it ever genuine? The large popular support for Christianity. In 1 John it says, they went out from us, but they did not really belong to us. For if they had belonged to us, they would have remained with us. But their going out showed that none of them belonged to us. There's also, you could put a spiritual dimension on all of this. We can study social causes, but the New Testament provides a spiritual explanation. Where here it says in 1 Corinthians by the mouth of Paul, and even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing. The God of this world, God of this age, has blinded the minds of unbelievers so that they cannot see the light of the gospel that displays the glory of Christ, who is in the image of God. Perhaps it is no different for us as it was in the beginning for them. So what should we do? And this is just my view. I believe we should actually encourage a more intelligent faith. That's what we try to do in apologetic organisations like us. Because Paul says, be wise in the way you act towards outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how to answer everyone. I think there's an indication here that we should actually be interesting people, full of grace, seasoned with salt. So we should have actually had something to contribute by actually thinking through things instead of treating our faith in a mindless way. There's also a need to return to radical Christianity. So Jesus was radical and countercultural. Christianity should not be wed to culture. This is what it says in Isaiah. These are the ones I look on with favour, those who are humble and contrite in spirit and who tremble at my word. So how do we actually view Scripture? Do we actually look at it with great intensity and tremble before it, wanting to understand what it says? So Christianity is only really relevant if we're different, if we actually offer a radical alternative. So there's also the fact that there's our responsibility, and there's always the responsibility of the hearer as well. Ultimately, no one can blame our culture or the church. Everyone is responsible for seeing through their culture. So we have all these cultural pressures that hits everybody, like materialism, like all distractions, the things that are accepted. But we should look at our own culture very analytically. Now, I've included here on the top right a picture of the man. This picture is called The Man Who Did Not Salute. And here it is over here, and here's a single man in the crowd. His name was August Lundmesser. He's around, this is in a shipyard in 1938, and they've been addressed by maybe Hitler himself or one of his followers. And he's surrounded by people who are all taken in. They're all saluting. And he, on his own, didn't like what he saw, and he refused to salute. It's all very tragic. Most of the reason was because he had a Jewish wife. And there was a lot of anti-Jewish sentiment, and he opposed what was happening to his wife. But because he showed such rebellion, he was put in prison. His wife was taken away to as part of the Jewish persecution. She ended up being gassed. He was eventually released from prison, and he was sent out on the Russian front, which was virtually a suicide mission. So he was killed during the war on the Russian front. So he suffered basically because he was surrounded by idiots. And these people could not see what was happening in their own culture. And they suffered too, and they brought this man down with him. So, and the same thing, what it does prove, maybe our situation is not as bad as it was then, but it does show that a whole culture can actually be fooled. So everyone should seek the truth, and everybody has that responsibility. So here's a quotation which I remember vividly when I read the Pilgrim's Progress. So, I saw in my dream that the man began to run. Now he had not run far from his own door, when his wife and children, perceiving it, began to cry after him to return. But the man put his fingers in his ears and ran on, crying, "Life, life, eternal life." So he looked not behind him, but fled towards the middle of the plain. So where's it place us? Are we satisfied with bread and circuses, or is there more to life? And this is the promise of Jesus. Ask, it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, it will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds. And to the one who knocks, it will be open. So I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to, if I can find it, stop sharing. And now the meeting is open to all of you. And so you can you unmute your microphones? So see if you can unmute your microphone.
No, I can't.
Right. Oh, others are successful. Well, we could. Brian, you're taking the mickey out of me, aren't you?
You shouldn't have swallowed Mickey in the first place.
Well, you work. Anyway, anybody who'd like to contribute verbally, please unmute your microphones. But what we'll do to start off with is we'll actually go through the chat line. Some of these are, Derek Sylvie would like one of my t-shirts. I'll talk to you about it later, but I think we'll skip that comment. Now let's see. Brian, you've got a comment here. It's never been about the church fighting against science, etc. Would you like to, I'll read out your comment. It has never been about the church fighting against science. In fact, Christians and Christianity has been at the forefront of establishing and developing science. Rather, it was about those wanting, not God, trying to use science to attack the church. Would you like to talk to that?
I misspelled attack.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things Gordon was saying was that one of the reasons people turn away from the church is because the church has attacked science for disagreeing with the Bible. Whereas I was particularly enlightened along this line when I spoke myself on the Christian roots of modern science a couple of years ago, Reasonable Faith. And I learned quite a lot through preparing that. Just how relevant Christianity was to the foundations, to the development of science all the way through. And Kevin, you mentioned some of those later people as well, who, although not mentioned in your lectures, nevertheless had Christianity as the centerpiece of their science. It wasn't just separate compartments, a separate faith. It was central to their science, to their belief system. And it was only those who wanting to use science to try and discredit Christianity that have been attacking. And the attacking has been coming from the anti-Christian side rather than from the Christian side. As a general rule.
Yeah, I slightly disagree with that. I agree in the sense that early on, there was no real discrepancy between science and Christianity, a lot of harmony, in fact. But over the last century or so, particularly with the rise of fundamentalist creationism in America, they do attack science. There's no doubt about it. I mean, they're simply denying biology, they're denying paleontology, they're denying evolution. There's a lot of stuff like that going on. Now, it is not all of Christianity, of course, but there is a fraction of Christianity, a very vocal fraction of Christianity, who is trying to introduce an absolute literal interpretation of the first 11 chapters of Genesis, as opposed to what it should be, which is a Hebrew understanding of the first 11 chapters of Genesis. And they're very vocal, they're very vociferous, and in America, they're very influential.
Although here you're making blanket statements here along the opposite line, and why should I believe you and not them?
Yeah, I think this is a can of worms.
To Gordon, to suggest that the creationists, such as those in the US, are anti-intellectual. Some of them had put a great deal. I mean, they've got a number of PhD scientists who defend a creationist perspective, and they use science to do it. So I think to dismiss it,
Rodney, they don't.
I think they disagree with you quite fundamentally.
They have pseudoscience.
Well, I think they would strongly disagree with. And they've got PhD scientists, a lot of them. I've even read some of their literature. I don't think I should dismiss someone without reading them fairly. Yeah. It doesn't matter what the subject is.
I have read them. I have read them in great detail. Some of these people with PhDs and masters and so forth. Some of them with who are heralded as great theologists and so on. I have read their work in some detail, and it does not stack up to scientific examination.
I have to say,
excuse me, can I just stop this? This is a huge topic, and I don't think we can let it. I don't think it can let it distract from other things that have been raised. And we will give more attention to this to kind of look at all these factors in more detail later. But I don't think we can afford to actually be hung up on it tonight. I think we have to move on. So sorry, and that's. I'm not supporting one side or the other in saying it. I think we need to actually move on and consider some of the other items. Is that fair enough? Otherwise, we'll get nowhere.
I agree.
Okay.
Yeah, fair enough.
All right. Now, Dr. Rodney.
Kevin.
Yes.
I was just asking if you had a scientific basis for that decision to move on. But anyway, I digress.
Right, I'm very grateful for that.
I mean, my intention was not to debate.
No.
The whole issue of creation versus evolution. That was not my intention at all.
Yeah, I know.
To raise the characterization of creationists as all a bunch of idiots who are bigoted and narrow-minded and so forth, I think is extremely simplistic and unfair.
Yeah. All right. Okay.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. And I think your point has been taken. But Rod, we're moving on to your next point. All right. So, Rod, you said, I loved in the USA. Oh, sorry, you loved in the USA.
No, I lived.
Okay.
Right. The next line, because once you post it, you can't correct it.
I lived in the USA for about 10 years or so. The church was declining long before Trump. Would you like to say some comments about that?
Well, yes. I mean, Trump, I mean, obviously the Republican Party, which is generally a fairly conservative party, and you're more likely to have conservative Christians in the Republican Party. A number of, but there are Democrats who are also Christian as well. And some of them are conservative or middle of the road. And the church, I think, has been declining in the US. for a number of years, well before Trump. I don't think Trump has, started with him, or whatever we think of Trump. That's a separate issue. But I just couldn't see the evidence to substantiate that claim that Gordon made.
Yeah, I think your point is right. So that I don't think. Well, you can debate whether Trump helped or hindered, but it was happening a long time before Trump. And Brian agreed with you. He said, "I was thinking that too." Now, Stephen, actually, the creationist movement is not just from the US. All right, so I think we better kind of skip the.
Yeah, but I'd just like to correct folks, because I think as an Adelaide chapter, we should recognise there was a strong push from the origin of after America, right here in Adelaide.
Yeah, I think it is true that the creationist movement is not just limited to those.
Just blame the US if you don't like creationist movement, then we should turn our eyes back here in Adelaide, because Creation Ministries International started right here in Adelaide.
Yeah.
And now it's one of the more significant movements within the creation movement.
Yeah. Or just, I hope you forgive me for this, but I think I need to actually skip the comments on the creationists.
I agree, but I'll say just a comment, not whether for or against, but to say, hey,
yeah,
it's not the US. Right here in Adelaide, we have that movement in a significant way.
Yep.
True, we do. Yes.
Yeah.
Especially in Queensland.
Yep. All right. From a comment from Bronwyn. Falls from grace may also have been a turn off. Finding Christian partner is one of the big challenges for many people within the church. Bronwyn, would you like to speak to that?
Yeah. Oh, well, there's 2 points, I suppose. The falls from grace. I mean, there's big televangelists who've taken tumbles. I can't remember all their names off by hand, but they've either taken money or got involved in extramarital affairs, or they certainly haven't done Christianity any favours. And then, and the fact that it's a problem and it's been ongoing and getting even harder for people to find, when you mentioned the being unequally yoked, that is a dilemma, because a lot of Christian women, particularly, I would say, are finding it extremely hard to find Christian partners in the church. I don't know anything about you, but I don't see as many men in the church as there are women, and especially younger women, find it harder to find a partner.
They should encourage men to join the church.
We should. Where are they? Where are they? That's my question.
Interesting side point on that one. Given that Christianity is supposed to be so misogynist and anti-women, why are there more women in the church than men?
Yeah, I don't know.
I don't know. Misogynist women, Brian, by that logic.
Yeah.
But it's true. It's true that that it's getting harder and harder, even for young folks. I know a couple of young folks, like good friends, where this is such an issue, and because they're lonely, and now they're caught between, as you said, Gordon, don't be unequally yoked, versus, hey, if I really want to find a partner / a wife / a husband, then I've got to go outside of the church, or at least I've got to go to a different church, or and then that feels disloyal, and it's like, they're actually really caught. I feel very sorry.
It's a huge and difficult problem, and I haven't got any good answers really, but I'm just saying what the scriptural principle is.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
You're right, but it definitely is a challenge. Although, to go back to what you pointed out, Kevin, maybe it wasn't that different in the early church, was it? Maybe.
No.
Available pool was smaller.
Sorry, what are you referring to about the early church?
Well, you said that in the early church it was smaller, and now we're declining and we're the narrow way. So that means that it would, in the early church, if you'd come to faith in Christ, you know, you didn't always come to faith in pairs. Of course, lots of families did, and
Yeah.
whatever, but that would have been an issue in the early church as well, I
Yeah.
guess. Although it was growing, I guess the difference is it was growing. So a growing church for younger people has got to be easier to find partners than a church that's older and declining. Just look at this call.
Actually, one of the criticisms of the early church was that it's predominantly women.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it was something like a 60-40 ratio. It had a strong appeal to women.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Thomas Daly again, is the South America really in decline? Yeah, it looked like it was in decline from your demographic map, Gordon.
That was a bit of an overgeneralization. It's actually quite a complicated picture. It depends which part of South America we're talking about.
Yeah, okay. That makes more sense.
All right.
Thank you.
Now, Bronwyn again, I'm reminded of what Christ says in reference to the church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against her. Right.
Yeah, well, Christ refers to the church as a female, doesn't he? Will be wedded to Christ. Yeah, should we be really worried? Is this just a natural course? You know, when the Christians got sent off to all different parts of the world, eventually there was a revival. Yeah, I just don't know whether we should be that anxious about it, or whether we should be.
I would say we
going
should
with the
be a
flow.
little bit anxious because, I mean, part of the Lord's Prayer is your kingdom come, which basically means
Yeah,
we have a responsibility to gather in people into his kingdom, which
Yeah.
means a responsibility for evangelism, which means we should be trying for the church to expand.
yeah.
So we're falling down on our responsibility.
I agree with Gordon. I think that the list that Kevin and Gordon put up may be symptomatic of the fact that we as Christians might lose our sense of vocation to be partnering with God in bringing about his kingdom on earth. And all of those things are kind of symptomatic of that. They all hijack that attempt. And I wonder whether, a bit of an illustration would be a medical practitioner who starts off with all the best intentions of delivering good medical practice to his or her clients, but after a while becomes more interested in enriching themselves or playing golf or whatever, or egg timer medicine or whatever, and becomes a very unattractive example of their profession and almost worse than useless in that profession. So all of these things that deflect us from following that vocation should concern us. And, some group of people have to have a prophetic voice to speak into that, to, keep the church awake.
I see that as something that's missing in the modern church. I mean, I can think of very, very few churches which actually have a prophetic ministry. But we are told, I forget where in the New Testament, there's a quote somewhere, that we are to actively seek the gift of prophecy. But we don't see it. Why is that? Why are we doing something wrong?
Maybe
You find a lot of Pentecostal churches will have people either visiting or people amongst the congregation that would say, people could question it, that they do have the gift of prophecy. Some are accurate, others you might dismiss, but just because we haven't seen it doesn't mean it's not happening.
No, I agree. But I've been to some of these Pentecostal churches, and they're very keen on on the speaking in tongues and healing and things like that. But there are some gifts of the Spirit they kind of backpedal on, and that seems to be one of them. Now, I agree with you. There are a few churches with a prophetic ministry, but they're few and far between. And some of the so-called prophets, I mean, we had a lot of prophets in America predicting that Trump would win the last election. Well, you know, it gives the whole concept a bit of a bad name, doesn't it?
Yeah, the New Testament makes clear that just because someone prophesies doesn't necessarily mean they're right. It says that the prophets should be judged.
Yes. And the penalty for getting it wrong was death.
That was the Old Testament, not the New Testament.
Yes, I agree.
Maybe we don't recognise prophecy when we see it anyway.
True.
Yeah. All right. Okay, Gordon, I think you're getting yourself into trouble tonight. Comment from Brian. On what basis do you refer to the text of Samuel as a parable? It is presented as history. Parables in the Bible are clearly identified as parables. Is it necessary to believe?
That last line is totally separate. It was a comment later that the Zoom
yeah, okay. Stick together. All right, well, you stick with your first bit, all right? I mean, would you like to comment on your first bit?
Okay, maybe, well...
Well, yeah, I said let Brian speak first and then you can respond.
Go for it, Brian.
Yeah, you had that passage out of Samuel about the Ark of the Covenant and the Philistines, and you were calling it a parable to be interpreted rather than a historical story to be presented as what actually happened. There is no indication in the text that I'm aware of that says this should be treated as a parable. It was presented as being something that happened.
Okay, maybe the choice of words of calling it a parable is not quite accurate, but it's acting out in history something that has significance for the future. And the reason I say that is when you actually look at every time in the Old Testament that you see the Ark of the Covenant, it has significance, not just in Israel's immediate history, but in terms of future interpretation. And yeah, it would take a long time to actually go through the argument, but I could easily do that.
I think Brian was concerned that you're inferring it was non-historical.
Oh no, it's historical, but that history is also encapsulates spiritual truth with futuristic application, with New Testament application. Okay, maybe I'm using the term parable in a rather bigger context than you normally would. Okay, perhaps I should rephrase it, but it's a bit of history, but it's not just Old Testament history. It has something very important to say about the church now.
Yeah. And Brian, you also said, is it necessary to believe the West equals USA?
Obviously, you did not believe that, but nevertheless, the thrust of what you were saying seemed to be so centered on the United States. And I know the United States presents itself as being all that matters in the world, nothing else exists. And to such an extent that we tend to believe it, but it is in fact not true that is the world, or even the West.
It's absolutely not the truth, not the whole world. And in America, you know, there's a lot of good churches which are not at all extremist, and you know, they vote Democrat and so on.
If you're a Republican and you're an extremist, are you? That's that very dangerous conclusion.
There is that.
Really, Gordon, you walk right into it.
I know, I'm always over.
That's a very dangerous. My son is a Republican. I'll tell him that.
I wish I had $1 for every time I open my mouth and put my foot in it. But,
make sure you clean your feet.
All right.
But I would like to say though that the American cultural religion, if you like, it's the dominant Christian viewpoint, has an effect which goes well beyond the boundaries of America through cultural transfer. I mean, you can see the cultural influence of America in particular and the West in general all the way through Africa, large parts of Asia, through Oceania and South America and all the rest of it. That transfer of American culture, including extremist Christian culture, I think is undeniable. It's very strong. It's not the whole world, but it is very strong.
Right, next comment from Brahman again. You've been very active. Good for the women. I think the established Orthodox Church, i.e. the Church of England Catholic Church, also turned a lot of people off due to childhood sexual abuse. Could you like to talk to that?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you talk just in, staff rooms or with people, just in conversation and church comes up, some people will mention sexual abuse of priests and, all over the world. It's been so catastrophic that it's, you just can't begin to estimate the damage it's done.
Yeah.
Those who want to oppose Christianity, I mean, that's just they just see.
Oh, they do, yeah. Mm.
But it's also from us as well.
Yeah.
People who are Christians are disgusted with the church.
They are, yeah, yeah, and then they walk away from it.
The point of going to church, don't want to be part of it.
Yeah, I even had a Catholic neighbour whose sister was a nun, and her sister had said to her, "You should stop going to mass." And I said, to her, "You like going to mass? That's where you get your fellowship." I said, "Just ignore it. This type of stuff happens everywhere, all over the world, in all different institutions, not just the church. Keep doing what you're doing." Like, that came from a nun. I'm like, it's just ridiculous. Yeah.
Actually, there's a lot of focus on what happens in the church, but 95% of sexual abuse occurs in the home.
Yeah.
So the cameras are just pointing in one direction.
Yeah,
that's true.
So if you kind of look at the statistics, it's nowhere near as predominant as what is portrayed.
Yeah, well, look what happened to Archbishop Pell. We believe now it was thrown out because, look, I really feel for those young boys who were abused. I totally believe they were abused, but they somehow had allowed it to form a creation in their mind that he was the one involved. And where they were going after him because he just happened to be the head of the church at the time, truth was perverted, apparently. Once the evidence was looked at, there were a number of people that had been with Archbishop Pell at the time. It said it could not have happened because we were actually with him at the time these boys said it happened. And yet somehow I guess the media, let's crucify
Syria, probably.
Bob said crucify him anyway, and we can see that can overturn truth.
Yeah, there are the two aspects. There's that one where the world wants to tear down the church. There's also the fact that Christianity has got higher standards than everything else. Yeah. And we have these standards. We preach these standards to the world. And when we don't reach up to those standards, we are held to a much higher level than anyone else is. And again, someone else is to do the same thing. They are not looked down on anywhere near as much. Rockstar, for example, who is to do something along some of these lines, would almost be thought to be doing a favour.
But Brian, we're talking about leaders of the church who preach the gospel, who tell people to do the right thing, and then while all the time they were doing the wrong thing. Not the wrong thing, but really evil thing to destroy other people's lives. And on the issue of Pell, that saga is not finished. It continues.
Well, I say, but look, I'm sorry, I'm a Protestant. I believe 2 Timothy says, forbid not marriage. It's celibacy, in my mind, that the Catholic Church went way beyond what Scripture teaches. It should never have happened. And it apparently was only about, 1,000 years ago that it was first really introduced. Prior to that, celibacy was an option only.
It's inhuman.
It is, exactly.
Yeah. What's actually a good reason the saga is not yet finished, June?
Well, we're in Melbourne, so we know of murmurings and other comments, and investigations continue. It's just a matter of when they'll be brought to court, if they'll be brought to court.
Yeah. All right, better move on. Bronwyn again. Gee, you've been very active. Education,
Yeah.
masters and common people started by the church. Yeah.
Oh, well, in Wales and England, in I think it was it Wesley, in the early. Well, someone help me here. The 1700s. They were the one. They established the education for the poor kids, and their main form of literature was the Bible. They basically started educating the children so that they could read the Bible. That was in England. And I know the Catholic Church has been instigative in starting educating the poor children, but yeah, it's been Christianity that has adopted the let's teach everyone scripture, teach them the gospel, which has led to education.
All right, thank you. Brian, you've got a big comment here. Would you like to handle it?
Yeah, well, it's kind of seemed to me from observation that those churches which are doing their best to fit in with everything else around, to be as like as possible to the world around, so as not to put people off. We don't want to offend anybody. We want to be welcoming. We don't want to be different so that people are scared to come in. We want to look like everything else. They're the ones who seem to be losing more than the others, because people think, well, if they're no different to anyone else, what's the point of going there? I might as well go to the football instead. But those churches who have solid basis for their faith, what they believe in, who are not afraid of being different if they believe that different is right and true, they're the ones that are growing and are doing better. And that includes the Pentecostals, as was mentioned. Interestingly, it also includes Roman Catholicism, that to a very large extent, the Catholics have said, well, this is our position, that's it, we're not changing it, for right or for wrong. But that certainty has appealed to people. Again, the child sexual abuse has been an issue that scared people off for very good reason. But there is still that there with Roman Catholicism. And even Islam is gaining traction because people see in Islam something that stands firm and is not just trying to be the same as everything else. They have something concrete to go with.
Do you think Catholics are reducing in numbers at the moment?
Yeah. Okay. May I add, Brian, that the Sydney Anglican Church, which holds a largely conservative view, is probably the largest Anglican diocese in Australia, and indeed is strongly united with the conservative Anglican churches in Africa as well, and they unite when they try and fight the liberal tendencies, say in the UK and the US.
Well, like Brian, with like Islamic women have distinctive dress, don't they? And sometimes the men too. Do you actually think that that's a factor that might actually help them?
Amongst certain groups, I think it would.
They stand for something, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, Stephen, I think this is a rude remark directed at me.
Sorry.
So the Simpsons are more important than Australian politics. Ned is more recognisable than Scott.
That brings us back to what Gordon was saying before about American culture, doesn't it?
Well, I like Neddy Flanders, actually. Scott, all right.
It's temporary, though. It reminds me of the Beatles, who at one time claimed to be more popular than Jesus Christ. Now, who nowadays in popular culture remembers the Beatles very much, but Christ is still going.
No, we remember the Beatles.
Yeah, Beatles was eating my lawn.
That dates me as well.
All right, Eric Love to everyone. I was talking to an African pastor this week. He was adamant that one of the needs that the church needs these days is signs and wonders. When people see healings, etc., they'll believe in God. Would you like to speak to that?
Yeah, so that's what he said, among other things. That's not the only thing he said we need, but he said, and it seems to make sense, that if people see miracles like we saw in the New Testament, then more people might believe in Jesus because of that.
Hmm.
Can I just sort of respond to that? I've been to parts of Africa where you do see healings quite a lot. I mean, and extraordinary miracles, astounding miracles that have happened in Kenya and Tanzania, Mozambique, a few places like that. And I've been looking at where and when and in what circumstances you find these sort of things. There's a kind of pattern. If the church is just beginning, or if it's emerging from extreme persecution, very often the church begins with the Lord producing all these extraordinary miracles. As the church matures, and Christians, they kind of progress from being impressed with miracles to Christian maturity, and the importance of miracles kind of tails off. So I think there's a sort of correlation, rough correlation, between where and when you get these miracles and the maturity of the Christian church where it's happening.
I'm not sure the maturity is quite the right word.
Well, how would you put it, Brian?
Church moves on, they decide they need something a little bit more, and they concentrate on other areas, including intellectual sides of things more, and they lose track of the more spiritual side of things. And I think someone else mentioned something a little bit later on about needing, that there's more to Christianity than just intellectual stuff.
Oh, there is indeed. But my view would tend to be that all this fascination with signs and wonders, it's fine to start with, but it doesn't lend itself to Christian maturity. And I think churches and individuals need to move on from that.
I think my point is that it's generally people who decide that rather than God.
And may I say, there's a bit of a warning here, as if we do read the Revelations and 1 or 2, perhaps the 2 Thessalonians, the final great man of evil is going to be able to do signs and wonders that will deceive even the elect. So we've got to be very careful that where the source of these miracles are coming from, can Satan can certainly mimic them and will do so in the future.
Of course, you can't deceive unless there are real things to be imitating or mimicking.
Yes, true.
Right, okay, we'll move on. Comment. From Bronwyn again. How does the explosion of Christianity in China factor into all this?
Yeah. Well, we're talking about the decline of Christianity. Well, and in China, it's literally exploding. So,
more probably exploded.
Yeah.
There was big growth probably in late 20th century is probably when the biggest growth was, to the point where it's hard to tell what they think China might be, around 10% Christian.
Which is a lot of people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or added to that, they reckon that the fastest growing church in the world is in Iran.
Yep.
Wow.
And I suppose my point is that I don't know whether they're taking a very intellectual beginning. It's not. It's more like early church stuff. It's from miracles, signs and wonders, revelation. That's how their growth is starting. It's not starting from the other end.
Yeah.
Fastest growing though can be misleading, because if you start from a 0 base and you go from 1 to 10, that's a 1,000% increase. So the smaller the base.
Yeah, I'm aware of that.
Yeah.
So it depends, percentage in growth is not necessarily a good indication of the extent of growth.
Yeah. Can I say, I have some friends who've come back from Nepal and worked as helpers there in the medical side of things. So you can't have missionaries in Nepal. For up to a few years ago, Nepal had the highest rate, but that's because it was coming from a very small base.
Yeah.
Sadly, like many churches in the early growth phase, it's the second generation who are not necessarily believing what their first generation converts. And like many others, there's that difficult second phase where parents are strong believers, but their children, God has no grandchildren.
He doesn't know.
God yourself.
Yeah.
That's always the hindering point anywhere in the church, be it here in the West, or in the case of Nepal. Korea, for instance, I think is now plateaued and is somehow falling away for the very same reason.
Right. Rod, would you like to talk to your next comment?
Yes. Well, I certainly recognise the importance of apologetics in the Christian faith, but I also think that sometimes we put such an emphasis on it that we can lose sight of being really a real faith commitment, which is really life-changing. And I know some people don't have a great intellectual ability. That's okay. It's gospel still for them as well. And sometimes they need something simple that's encouraging to them. It's not always a great, it's not always a great intellectual explanation that helps a person. And sometimes skeptical minds will be so skeptical that you won't be able to effectively communicate with them anyway. That's not to say that we shouldn't try. So I think we need to keep the two in balance myself.
Yeah. Well, the
like
gospel's for the foolish as well as the wise, isn't it?
That's right.
I think Rod makes a good point there. A well-rounded Christian life has, if they want it, a very sound intellectual base, but that's not what we should be reliant upon. What we should be reliant upon is our faith and how we are led by the Lord and how we operate in terms of his logos and rhema, and how we interact with the Holy Spirit and all that sort of stuff. That's really what's important. But for some people, the intellectual side is important, and we need to be sure that that basis is there for those who want it.
I couldn't agree more, Gordon. I mean, I studied theology for about at least 20 years. So I struggle with my faith. I really did.
Taking Rodney's point, I think it's the people who are more intellectually inclined who really need to be reminded of this fact that it's more than just intellectual thing. And it's those who are not intellectually inclined who need to be reminded that there is a solid basis for our faith as well. It's not just what we want to believe.
Yeah.
And this balance is really hard to get right.
Yeah.
Extremely hard to get right.
It is.
We need to put a bit of effort into trying to get a good balance.
If we don't, and I really agree about the question of balance here, but I think the thing that changes the balance is the internet. And yes, I agreed with what both of you said, Gordon and Kevin, about the decline happening a long time ago. But there was an event, September 11, that hastened the cultural decline, whether it hastened the decline of actual spirituality or Christianity or not. But it hastened the actual numerical decline, because the anti-theists, not those who thought we were irrelevant, but the anti-theists, the four horsemen of the annual apocalypse, got voice, and then that trickled down to the waiting media and social media, and so if we don't at least prove that there is, we don't need everybody to understand it, but unless we prove the case for an intellectual base for Christianity, and we get the younger folks to ask questions and examine their faith, we're doing them and our culture and our church no favors, and I don't think we're following in the footsteps that we should be.
Yeah.
Okay, we will move along. Eric, about intellectuals overrepresenting the church.
I think that was a response to, something just before. We often think of the unis as the anti-Christian places, but it's long been the case in Australia that the non-intellectual strata have been less Christian than the intellectual ones.
That's a harsh statement. I don't know about that one.
I was brought up in working class and or the non-working class as well, and there's amongst that group that was pretty anti-Christian. your ochre element and just to kind of work amongst working class men, it was pretty strong anti-Christian environment too.
I mean, I had a professor in ethics, Christian ethics, who said that if you're an evangelical Christian, he thought you had sacrificed your intellect. That was like a red rag to a bull when he said that to me.
All right,
sounds like he sacrificed his intellect.
The next comment is very interesting. Sorry, Kevin, bad attempt at levity. Tom Daly, would you like to talk to that?
Yeah, that's when I tried to make a joke about science when you were moving on, and it was really a bad idea. Sorry, Kevin.
All right, I accept it. No, I don't. All right, Eric, in Australia, 2 men in every church, in church to 3 women.
So that was just commenting on discussion earlier that there are, if you look at Aussie adults in church, it's 60% female. As it happens, I'm doing a research project that, among other things, is looking at immigrant churches in Adelaide. In a lot of the African churches, it's even more heavily female dominated.
Yeah. All right, Derek's made an interesting comment here with reference to David Finlay. I'm not sure whether David still is. David Finlay, doctors have patients, not clients. They belong to lawyers and prostitutes. Derek, would you like to talk to that comment? Oh, you might not be here, but I think there's a bit of a hit and run comment.
I think a lot of these words are being.
Kevin, you could answer it, Kevin.
A lot of these words are being redefined. For example, universities used to have students, but now they have clients.
Oh, yeah. Okay. All right. There's a comment from Eric on plenty of scandals in our Protestant churches too. I think we can acknowledge that. But all right, at this stage, we finished going through the comments, so it's open slather to anybody who didn't put down a comment or would like to actually ask questions or make comments. So go for it.
Do we need Chinese missionaries in Australia?
Probably.
Not bad idea.
I've often wondered. I mean, that's one of my big things at the moment. One thing I've discovered recently: there are 17 African churches that I know of in the city of Playford. So that's where I live. That used to be one of the least Christian parts of Adelaide. Now it's probably a little more Christian than average, just because there's suddenly another 1,000 church attenders in the area, or more, I don't know. And so I'm wondering what they are going to do, and whether the white Aussies of my area will eventually be reached with the gospel by these African Christians.
All right, I'm just going to ask a question of the general audience, like, or all of you. With the decline in Christianity, should we be concerned about it, and what do you think we should do?
Yes, we should, and I think we can and should draw up some sort of, I don't know what the word would be, not manifesto, but some sort of declaration that these are the areas that we can change. These are things that where the church can move forward, and try and think up some way in which we can push this agenda along a bit, because at the moment nothing much seems to be happening.
I say, Gordon, I think you hit the nail on the head about prosperity. We only, as you were saying it, I was thinking immediately the parable of the sower. Remember the different types of things that would stop a seed growing? One of them was the weeds, the riches. Jesus said it was going to happen. And as long as prosperity is around, I think it's always one of the curses. The final letter to the churches, to the church at Laodicea. You've grown lukewarm. I'm going to spit you out of our mouth because you're self-sufficient in all your prosperity. I don't know. It's a very hard thing to overcome, I think.
Well, the other thing is, we never know what our evangelistic efforts will lead to. They can be very subtle, and something can flare into life even long after we're gone. You know, I'm looking back to when I was a student in England several eons ago. None of us at college were Christian until one guy from America, wonderful Christian. Looking back on it, I don't agree with everything he said, but a lot of what he said was good, and he turned things around. You know, dozens of people who had no interest in Christ at all turned and became Christianity. And you know, 50 years that he planted seeds, and those seeds have been growing in different parts of the world for the last 50 years or so.
Good. Gordon, what did he do that was right?
He opened his house to Bible studies, and he got people interested, and he was a really friendly guy, and sort of invited students around any time of the day or night for a chat. And he was working for an organization called the Navigators. I don't know whether you've heard of it. And he put us through some basic training in Christianity, and it was brilliant, and that has lasted my whole life. And I know for a fact that it's lasted through many other lives. And that was just one person just committed to doing what he could for the kingdom of God. And I don't think we should be bothered as to whether we're going to make our church mushroom into a mega church or whether we just influence a few guys. The Lord can take small seeds and make it grow. And so long as we're following his leading, that's all that counts, really.
Yeah, there are two aspects to Kevin's question. One, what should we as the church be doing? And two, what should we as individuals be doing? And I think you were looking at that second one there, Gordon.
Yeah.
Elaine, your microphone's off.
Jeff Russell's been very quiet tonight.
Just being the light among the people, letting our light shine, and this draws people to us, I think. We don't have to be marvellous, but just being that light, whether it's the workplace, the church, or whatever.
That's good, Paul.
May I just, some of you might, in Melbourne anyway, might know Gil Can. He was formerly of the Uniting Church and the evangelical movement of it. He put the point that the church in Australia more or less started to go, in fact, the Western world, when the social revolution happened at the end of the 60s. That's when, for the first time, for something like 1,500 years, the Bible was no longer regarded as an authority book. And he said, now we're living, and you've heard the expression, the post-Christian age. He said, don't get disappointed. Now you can walk into your office, tea room, or some other area where you are, and for the first time you can now preach the gospel to people who have not been inoculated with religion. They don't know religion. You're speaking about it, in some cases anyway, for people who've heard it, the gospel for the first time. You have an opportunity that people had not had for decades because everyone had heard it. Oh, I've heard all that before. Now that's not the case. So it was both, if I say the downside, yes, the Bible's no longer regarded as relevant, but the upside is you've now got people who've never been inoculated.
Yeah, good point.
There was something that Mark Sayers, I don't know if any of you guys follow Mark Sayers from Red Church in Melbourne, and they were locked down for the longest time. He was on the Church Leaders podcast with Carey Newhoff, and they've been looking, these guys work with Barna. They have the Barna research guys on there each week on the Church Pulse. And I've been listening to this since about February last year when they started. Mark Sayers was on, and he was talking to Carey, who's a Canadian. And he said, well, you know, the thing is that in Australia, we went through the end of cultural Christianity quite a long time ago. And he said, yeah, we've had a bit more of a decline. He said, so in Melbourne, what we're engaged in is building a remnant. And that really appealed to me because he's being realistic. He's not being upset at all that the church is going to go away, because it ain't. No matter what, you know, your West Coast of America social media companies think. It isn't going anywhere. Doesn't mean your local church is not going away. And in fact, the Barna figures on that are quite interesting. That God would prune his church from time to time. I think Kevin, I think you made that point. So I don't think we should worry, but I do think we should ask the question of what debt do we have to pass on to the next generation? And I think that's something that drives me. And I think Bronwyn and I are quite often on the same page with things like that.
Mm. And I'm reminded too that we're living in Australia, which is becoming more multicultural, and we're getting more opportunities to sort of rub shoulders with people from other faiths. And if we don't really know, understand what makes us different from them, then we lose our advantage, because Christianity runs rings around every other religion because it's grace-based. So we've really got to understand that so we can feel confident when we're talking to them as well. Yeah.
I think we can get overly concerned about church growth and or the growth in the Christian faith in numbers that isn't necessarily very helpful, and perhaps shouldn't be what we focus on. I think we do need to, as individuals and as churches, consider evangelism and how we actually present the gospel to other people, and we should be about that. And we should be about, as somebody said, I think it was Elaine said, about the light shining forth from us in day by day. And we need to encourage one another to do that, and ways in which we do that. We need to consider whether we're effective in the light shining from us, and how to improve the light shining from us, how to improve our giving a reason for the faith which we have within us to people. We can stimulate one another in this sort of way and encourage one another and improve. But growth is actually in God's hands as to whether he opens people's hearts or not. We can't actually make that happen. And we can get wrongly focused on that. You know, the decline in numbers may be that cultural Christians have fallen away, and I think that's very largely the case. It's not the church growth as such per se is not our responsibility, and we shouldn't focus just on that. We should be about how we encourage one another to live the Christian life, which involves witness in terms of our daily lives and our words as well, our preaching. I really think that's where it should be for us. And to leave the actual, whether the church grows in numbers or not, is no reflection on the on the wonder of our God and our Messiah, the Christ, and it's no reflection on how glorious the church is and what God's great plan. If the church apparently declines in Australia, so be it. That's it could be God's judgment on Australia, and it might yet be that way. So I kind of feel like, although yes, we can notice all these things, why people give what reasons people give for avoiding the church or leaving the church. Yeah, we can notice these things. We have to be careful what we actually are going to do about that. No.
Yeah, but yeah, isn't that a bit, when we're talking about, not much growth, so be it, isn't that a bit harsh, considering that every person who does not become a Christian is a tragedy, that their eternal salvation is gone. And that should trouble us, I think.
Yes, it should be a prompt for us to both to witness in our words and also in our actions to show the love of God and God's way to other people. I agree with that. But like Isaiah was told, God would commission him as the prophet to go to the nation, and he said, "Look, you'll be preaching day by day by day, and the people won't hear you. They'll block their ears. They're not going to respond to you, and your words are going to fall on deaf ears." And but nonetheless, that's what he had to do, and it could be that that's what we are called to do in our particular society at this particular time. Another time, another society, it might be different. And praise God, his word still goes out. His word will not return to him void. We can trust God in that. I think we can get wrongly focused on what we should do about church growth.
I think in the New Testament, there's plenty of advice on how we should live, isn't there?
Yeah.
So you're saying we can only do what we can do, but then again, the important thing is that we do actually do what we can do.
That's true too. Yeah, we can easily sit on our hands, can't we? And or hide the light under a bushel. Yeah.
It's not a matter of numbers, getting notches on a belt, how many people we've got in our church, anything like that. You're quite right. But I was still, when you were saying all that, feeling something similar to what Gordon said about all these people. They are people for whom Christ died. And as it says in the New Testament, God is not willing that anyone should perish, that all come to a knowledge of the truth and to repentance.
Yep.
So
that passage that Jeff quoted, it's from Isaiah 6. Go to the people who will not hear. I think that might be the most commonly quoted passage in the New Testament, from the Old Testament. That's quoted quite a number of times in the New Testament, which is interesting because when people read Isaiah 6, they stop before they get to that bit.
Jeff, I sort of half agree with you, but I half feel like it's self-serving. I know you don't. That I sort of go, yeah, that would give me an easier life. It would mean that I don't have to wrestle with these problems. It means that I don't need to feel a responsibility for my brother. It doesn't, that may be the outcome, but it doesn't. That doesn't feel right.
How did you get that from what I said?
That's how it sounded like, which is why I'm asking. I'm sure that's not what you meant, right? But that's how it sort of felt. Do you want to correct me?
I can see Tom's point that you can start to think that way. If you start with where you were at, Jeff, which we agree with, it's very easy to go on to what Tom was saying.
Let me put it in a simplistic sort of way. If we're concerned about church numbers, the number of people actually coming to church, let's start a basketball club for our young people. Let's so they'll have ways in which they can be in church and enjoy basketball and the team spirit, etc., and compete with us. And so we'll boost our numbers. But is that actually anything to do with the gospel? Is the gospel actually coming to these people? I think a lot of that sort of thing was done in the past, and people have ended up, they attend the church basketball club, for example, but then it just falls away because you find, there's other more exciting things, better basketball clubs out there in the world, and better this and better that.
Yes,
So-
sorry, no, Jeff, I totally agree with that. I totally there. Absolutely. It should be about spiritual growth and it should be about discipleship.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. But it was the next bit that I sort of heard. It was like, okay, so what were you suggest? I agree with that bit. So what were you suggesting though was our responsibility? That's the bit that I think maybe I misinterpreted.
Our responsibility is to live faithful lives as Christians, which means to be to preach the word in season and out of season, as it were, to be ready to give an answer to everybody that asks the reason for the faith that's in you. In other words, we should actually be witnessing for Christ, and I wish I was able to do that more and more effectively. But we should be actually by both directly and indirectly presenting the gospel to non-Christians and showing how wonderful is the message of Jesus. Okay. And I think we do this in good works too. Jesus said, let your good works shine before men. They may see your good works and glorify God in heaven. It should draw people. Not that we sound a trumpet about our good works, because he says too, you can let your right hand know what your left hand's doing, this sort of thing. But nonetheless, we should be people of integrity and compassion and good works generally that come out of our faith. And this is a witness to Christ as well. And then whether that bears fruit or not is God's work. And we're still called to do these things. So I think we have a responsibility as brothers and sisters in the Lord to help one another, to encourage one another in this direction. But that's not directly working out, well, how can we make our church grow? How can we make the number of people who claim to be Christian in Australia increase? I don't think that's directly our concern, really.
No, but I think what we're engaged in here is how do we enable people to be able to hear the gospel? We can speak it, but if we speak it in a way that they can't hear it, then I just felt like that the exercise we're involved in reasonable faith is quite often how do we figure out how to enable people to be able to hear the gospel in a verified, in a truthful fashion, not a watered down gospel that might be more palatable to them, but the actual gospel.
Yeah, I agree. I think what Tom's saying, we should not only be concerned about what we do, but our strategy as well.
I think we can think about whether we're effective and how we can improve that and to stimulate one another in that way. And I think that's what we do. But that's a different thing from concentrating on, well, how do we actually grow the membership of the church, for example.
At this point,
have more children. Just kidding.
At this point, I think I'll stop the recording because it's past 9 o'clock. But can you stay online, because I'd kind of like to speak to you off camera. So I'll just stop the recording.